Guivarra. Welcome to Mundine's Truth Talking. A few weeks ago, the Productivity Commission released its report and recommendations on an Indigenous evaluation strategy. The report starts with the following statement. Policies and programs that affect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are not working as well as they need to. Part of the problem is that there is little evidence about what is working, what isn't, where and for whom. The executive summary opens with the following statement. After decades of developing policies and programs designed to improve the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we still know little about their impacts or how outcomes can be improved. Don't mind the polite language. What the Productivity Commission has concluded is this. We have no idea of what most Indigenous programs are working. We have no idea if the billions spent improving Indigenous lives is doing any good. Take one look at the woeful results of the Closing the Gap strategy for over a decade, and Blind Freddy can tell you they are not. The Productivity Commission has called for a complete overhaul of the billions spent on Indigenous programs. It has made recommendations on a framework for evaluating programs in the future. But tonight, I want to take a step back. How can we move forward if we don't know what's working, what's not, and why? In the past, I called for a complete audit of Indigenous programs. How is money being spent? What is being achieved? Tonight, I got the good, the bad, and the ugly back together again to talk about this idea. My guests are Nancia Guivarra, former multimedia journalist and executive director of Indigenous, a communications, PR, marketing, and media company. James Williams, entrepreneur and advisor to corporates and government. And of course, the ugly Darren Godwell, CEO of I2I Global. And the first question is, do we need a total audit of Indigenous programs and spending? And what should it be focused on? You want to have a go, Nancia? Let's
go. That's a really big question, Warren. Do we need a complete audit of Indigenous programs and their outcomes? Look, I think it's such a complex one that you'd have to, well, for me and for the observations that I've made about Indigenous policies and programs and impacts in the time that we have been basically, government has been directing funding since probably 67 towards those programs. I would think that there'd be enough information out there now, given the number of Aboriginal organisations and different policy program reviews, evaluations, reports that have been done through various mechanisms over the years to be able to hopefully not have to set up yet another institution that would, I think, maybe conduct reports or outcomes that may not be used again. So I think that it's a bit of a complex question, but I feel like haven't we done enough research over all these years to actually know what does work or what doesn't work? And shouldn't we just be going to our communities and our community organisations to find out, because they're often saying that that's what they want. They want to be included in the decisions and share in the ways that we address the challenges in our community, and that's what they're constantly saying. And I feel like if we did that, then perhaps the pathway to evaluating whether or not those services work might be a bit more smoother.
Yeah. Okay, Bad James, what do you reckon?
Thanks, Warren. Look, I think it's 500 and something pages of a well-written, bespoke discussion on evaluation and the need for it. It talks in very broad terms about a strategy. It doesn't define, to my level of satisfaction, a detailed framework, which is what I was expecting, or a methodology around what an evaluation framework should do in terms of Indigenous programs and so on. But it actually stops. It doesn't. I think it's not enough. I think, as Nancia was saying, it does the same thing that we've always done, which is we write a whole lot of stuff and very detailed work, I'm sure, with some people that are incredibly invested in the process, describing something as if it's the new panacea, the new horizon for the next 10 years, as we've had other panaceas introduced 10 years ago, and it'd be the same thing. We actually focus on evaluation as the panacea and the solution. And in my view, it's not. We have fundamentally, an execution problem. We don't, and we don't understand what drives execution, which drives, the behaviours that we need, that's necessary to give Indigenous people the opportunity and the options that they can actually flourish and grow, whether that's in a social context, cultural context, or economic context. The execution problem, the whole framework and our approach from government, we're effectively militating against potential success. In fact, we're actually walking down a path where I think we'll fail the same way, because we look at evaluation as the new panacea, the new solution. Any framework, any program, any policy needs a good evaluation methodology from the start to finish. That's not rocket science, but it doesn't solve the problem. We probably need to start thinking more about driving performance and what is it that we want and what performance looks like. And maybe that's what they're talking about in the evaluation stuff, but I wasn't compelling. I actually, as I gleaned through the report, I didn't see anything that really stuck out to me that said, this is really amazing. So yeah, I think we'll talk about that more, but that's probably the beginning for me.
Okay, thanks, James, for that. Okay, Darren, we'll get you in on here, and then after that, let's just open up, and you can just jump in and out as you please as we go through this conversation. Okay, so do we need this audit, and if we do, then what is its focus and what does it need to do, and if we don't, then what should we be doing? Okay, Darren.
I think where we are right now is we already have a pretty fair idea about that things aren't going the way we want to go. So if the purpose of an audit is to ascertain what's happening, then I agree with Nancia. That's been done to death, literally. It surprises me that in the framing of this work that the Productivity Commission didn't actually unleash some of those most powerful forces for change that we have in modern society, and that is the power of the market. We didn't see a lot of talk in the 517 pages about how to use market-based outcomes and spending from the public sector to achieve what you want. And it's almost now we start to get this kind of weird kind of world created in on itself, that because I tell you, you get 200 pages into a report like this and you've forgotten everything else that came before it, and you're just trying for dear life to get to the 517th page. But one of the things that surprises me is that we're not talking and looking at the prospects of the government as a purchaser of outcomes. And the government should step into the marketplace and say, this is the outcome we want. We want 10,000 jobs created in regional Australia. We're going to put aside $100 million. Is there anybody in the free market, is there anyone in the private sector, anybody in the community sector that really thinks they can have a go at creating those jobs? And if you do, then the money's yours. We've seen a lot of work internationally around impact investing. We've seen a lot of work for pay for outcomes. It seems like these incredible opportunities have just floated past Indigenous affairs. The other thing which I struggled with too is as I was going through the report,
Mate, you sound like me when I go down to Bunnings. The wife's always up with me because I'm going down to get a screwdriver and I come back with lawnmowers and a whippersnipper and a whole lot of other stuff, which I'm sure Mr. Bunnings would love.
So,
yeah, sorry, James, go on.
Sorry, Warren. I was going to say that coming off the point that Darren's talking about, particularly around accountability, it's very interesting because I sort of, when I thought about it today and I was reading the document, I thought, okay, so it talks about evaluation, and we all know data's good. We know that having a good baseline, framing how we want to, what sort of outcomes and performance and benefits we want from the investment, starting from policy straight into our programs, and obviously how we operationalize or implement that through our supply chain. All of those things government understands, and to some extent we've collected data, but sporadically and not systematically, that tells the whole narrative. And so perhaps there is a case from the strategy that we need to be more systematic and systemic in the way that we use data, so we understand the whole life cycle of performance, and that it needs to start from somewhere and end somewhere. But as Darren said, there's no accountability. Now, the issue, of course, with accountability is accountability relates to performance. And when you think about performance, where's the program project management framework? Because it has to deliver something where you have to understand what your outcomes, your benefits from the front, and you have to drive it through a performance framework to get the outcomes. We don't think about performance. We don't think about risk. And what's really fundamental to all of this is that this issue around accountability is that where there's no performance, where's the consequence? Where's the consequence? And I think this is the point. Like, if you think about how market model operates, as Darren mentioned, market model operates as consequence to failure, as much as there's consequence to being successful. But when you think about and this is breaking it apart again, you've got the political side, and this is the politicians and the leaders that actually frame the discussion as a policy, mandate by the government of the day, either supported or not supported by the opposition. So you've got the political side. Now, political leaders are accountable because they get elected every year. Not every year, rather, every 4 years or so. There's an election cycle. So we could argue there's some level of accountability to the market. We know that the community, if they don't get good outcomes from program performance, so the benefits doesn't flow in the right way into those communities, the options that should be available to them is not, and therefore there's no outcome. And so there's a degree of accountability, or at least they account for the consequence of poor performance. So they either get a benefit or a disbenefit from as a result of that investment. When you look at the bureaucracy in the middle, or that service ecosystem that's supposed to deliver that, where's the accountability? Who loses their jobs over poor performance? Misinvestment. If we don't get the result, then how is it that the very system that actually has the greatest amount of leverage and to deliver this is not accountable for its failure to deliver that performance or benefit that we expect? And I find that incredible, because it comes back to the same discussion I've sort of mentioned in previous points, where I think that inherently one of the issues with the public sector, and so if you think about the evaluation problem, is that the public sector has what I call a supply bias, and that is that their inherent bias is to deliver services, but they don't have to account for what the market wants, because ultimately their right hand takes the money off you to pay their left hand to deliver the service. So they draw revenue through taxation, they pay themselves, and they deliver a service back to you. The market can't turn around after they've delivered something to you to say, well, actually, I'm going to take my options, my preference, my money, and go somewhere else. And so this inherent problem means that the focus around valuation, I think, should be flipped around. I think we should be focusing on how we deliver a type of mechanism that holds this mechanism that delivers it accountable, because it should do what the market does, which is holds you account that if you're not making the coffee I want at the price that I want, I can go somewhere else. And right now, Indigenous people don't have an option. They actually don't, other than the fact that, maybe sometimes we say, well, if the CDP or, the job service programs, a job service provider model is not working, they go to market every couple of years. But in reality, they're so big that, there's other factors that influence that make sure that the people that are delivering the service, whether government purchases it or government is doing it itself, is that they're so big and so complex that it's hard to hold them accountable and to change the model. So they just keep on going with the usual people. There's just not enough, dynamism in that marketplace to actually really incentivize the right sort of behavior. So I don't think it's Indigenous people that should be incentivized. I think the people that should be doing it should be incentivized, but they're not. They're not incentivized to perform.
Yeah. Excuse me. Look, when I first got to be chair of the Prime Minister's Indigenous Advisory Council in 2013, this is in December, just after the election, I wanted to have an audit done because I wanted to know what was done out there. I wanted to know. I didn't want to reinvent the wheel and do what previous regimes had done, and they just regurgitate. I wanted to know what was going on. I wanted to know what the outcomes were happening, and then I wanted to know how we chop through this and actually put in a very business-like approach. The problem I have, and this is what this audit type processes is they're put up. It's like the planning of the plan of the study of the plan for the evaluation of the study. And this is what we've been doing for what, 40 years, 50 years, and I just make it crazy. Now, look, the thing I see is that the public service and the politicians and the academia, and this is what they do. They do research, they do all this stuff. Now, the Productivity Commission in the past has done some wonderful research, and they put it on the table in Parliament, and that's what happens with it. And that's it. And I've seen some incredible research they've done with incredible stuff, and no one does anything with it. They just keep on regurgitating and planning. Oh, we got to set up a committee to look at the research that was done so we can start planning to look at the plan that they're suggesting so we can do a study of that plan. And it just goes on and on and on. So, and you're right, James, that we should be looking at, okay, what are the needs? Focusing, like in a commercial sense, really. What are the needs of the people out there? What do they want? And for a crude term, I say the customer. What do they want, and what do they need? And actually delivering that. And the second, sometimes I did that in the past, but they forgot the second part. The second part, if you didn't do it, and this is where your point comes in, there's no accountability. Like there's none. Like I could sit in the public service, or I could sit in the minister's office till the cows come home, doing this stuff and spending money and doing things. Yeah. And if they fail or nothing happens or nothing changes, well, I'm still sitting in that office in the public service or the minister's office, and nothing happens.
Warren, if I could use an example about the focus on performance and paying for outcomes. So it might surprise some people that Indigenous affairs is not unique in the world when it comes to public sector administration.
Sure.
And some of the things that we're looking for as outcomes are not unique to or peculiar to Indigenous Australians. So in the international development sector, they very much have mechanisms in place to deliver accountability. And so they will very much monitor the contractor and obviously their efficiency, which is, are they using the money effectively? Are we securing the outcome that we purchased, that we said at the beginning of the process we wanted to buy? And then when they get to the end of the contract, they go, okay, then let's, from an accountability perspective, let's also look at how the performance of the contractor went. And that's really important because they rank those contractors then. And so the next tender process that comes around, as the contractors present themselves, those that have been there more frequently, they will have a rating. And they will rate that contractor's ability to deliver based on previous performance on previous contracts. And so this is a really important element of which is James's point around performance and accountability, and you link those two together. And when it comes to making that determination, there's some very well-established mechanisms within the corporate sector and the public sector about how to set some metrics to ascertain how a contractor is going in its delivery. And it's about time we stopped doing studies and evaluations and we started bringing in a lot of those things, because some of the biggest cries for help around accountability and outcomes are Indigenous peoples and Indigenous community sector organisations. And yeah, we joked maybe it's been 30 years, maybe it's been 40 years. I reckon it's been much longer than that the Indigenous community sector and Indigenous organisations have said, give us a crack at delivering on these services for the money that you're handing out to these other non-Indigenous entities. Just give us parity to do the same work in the same areas. And they are more than competent and capable and confident about being able to outperform. Nancia, you would have seen this across lots of sectors.
Yeah, I have. And I think coming from a marketing perspective, and I can see why you want an audit, Warren, is because, if you're going to do something, then you've got to, from the outset, what you need to do is work out what you're trying to achieve. So I think sometimes we're not very good at identifying what it is we're trying to achieve. And there's so many different levels of impact that can be had from government policies and programs from, we're looking at, so a nationwide level of inequity, and yet at the ground roots, at the grassroots, the solution for them might be different to another community. And can we actually evaluate it in a way that is universal? I don't think so. I think that the solutions to some of the challenges that our communities are facing they're different, because we're all living in different circumstances with different levels of historical treatment. And so I sometimes think that, looking at it at that top level fails to recognise where things have worked. And at other points, it doesn't recognise where we're just acquitting, I think is the right word, acquitting our processes and fulfilling compliance requirements. And I think James mentioned that before, in order for the government to prove that it hasn't taken a risk with public with public monies, which they do across the board. So, I think that if we were to look at what works, and I know that some of the reports that we do that, the Overcoming Disadvantage report, for example, does identify some of the programs that works, but those solutions may not be the same or needed in every community. So it really does need a localized solution, I think, for some of the things that we're trying to achieve. But yeah, as a marketer, you do an audit, you work out what you're trying to achieve, get that number to something else, and then once you've gone through your set of processes, at the end you do your audit again, or you evaluate it, and then you sort of see whether or not you've done what it's intended to do. That sounds fairly simple, but it seems to be something that's a bit elusive when you put in the bureaucracy in between that, I think.
Yeah, and their solution to this is, I agree 100% with you, Nancia. Their solution is that they want to set up another bureaucracy to do the audit, to do this stuff. which is just madness. You could go to the private sector. You could go out and grab an Aboriginal group out there, like yourself, Nancy, or even Darren or something like that, and you could do the audit. And you can come back and go from there. This idea that we set up another bureaucracy is like, it's just mind-boggling. You know, we've got more bureaucracies than you can poke a stick at in Indigenous affairs.
Well, I wonder if a radical suggestion might be, and this happens in industry where you're in the contracting business, is that there's some industry kind of parameters about what's an acceptable admin as a percentage of the overall and the delivery. Now, you can go, you can go hell for leather and get a big fat margin. But if all your competitors are doing less than that, then you quickly find it pulls people back to an acceptable industry level. I wonder if a radical suggestion right now is we don't turn around and we stipulate that there's going to be an 11% admin fee capped on all Indigenous funding, starting with the public sector agencies. So if it's $1 billion that's set aside, then 11% of $1 billion is set aside for the admin fee, for the bureaucracy, and then that's it. If they want to spend more than that, they find another way to do it. And if we cap that amount of administration and say, listen, this has just gone beyond a joke. We see more money appropriated to Indigenous affairs, and we see more money going into to places other than frontline service delivery.
Yeah, and you're right there too, because there was a productivity report that was done, 2014, that actually said that most of the money doesn't, about half the money doesn't even get out of Canberra. It's run into the bureaucracy. And then another 25% doesn't even get out of Sydney or Melbourne or Perth or the capital cities. And so you're getting this pittance actually hitting the ground. So look, I agree with this argument from what we hear from people, and all of us have been across the country from the community saying, hey, we want to do this. We want to do these things. So let us do it and get on with the job, and let's have accountability around that. And we actually, and that capping part is brilliant. This is what happens in business. They sit there and go, we're going to build a bridge. They'd be shocked if they found out that, $800 million, that $1 billion is still sitting in the head office paying for salaries of people to do reports.
Yep.
It's rather than the money actually being bent on the bridge. So this is the madness of it all. So look, it is a radical change. They need to really stop talking about the bubble, Canberra or Sydney or Melbourne or whatever, and actually, and you said it quite good actually, Nancia. Every community is different. I look at Bad James up there in the Torres Straits. They're different than the ugly people in Brisbane like Darren and the good people like Nancia. We got all these. And that's one of the papers I did for Malcolm Turnbull as Prime Minister. We said we have to regionalise this. I didn't describe what the region is. I just said regionalise, and we're looking at if remote community are different than people living in Dubbo, to people living, on First Day Island, to people who's living in Eastern Kimberleys or the Pilbara, and we've got to start having that. Having that approach and that attack to these things. The other thing that's interesting now, and I think we spoke about this before, is the private sector, actually the Indigenous private sector, is more than the $5 billion that the federal government spends.
Right.
More. And so are we doing a futile exercise here now where the Aboriginal business sector is just running away with it?
In a much shorter period of time in terms of the investment in that sector as well. Yeah. In the growth of that sector, that is. Yeah. Very good.
Where Nancy and Warren and Darren, where I think it's really interesting in this whole situation, particularly on evaluation, performance, and benefits or value that gets delivered, is that there's probably a couple of things. One for me is that what are we actually evaluating then? Are we evaluating performance of the service ecosystem that's supposed to transform and create the options that actually ultimately Indigenous people leverage and then their circumstance transforms? Or are we evaluating and focusing on the behavioural transformation or change or shift in social, cultural and economic circumstance for Indigenous people. Because I thought closing the gap was just that. Every year we capture data that tells us that Indigenous people didn't go anywhere, that socially, culturally and economically, no movement. So that's a form of evaluation framework that's been around for some time. The issue, of course, is that I think this is the broader issue that I think the paper also doesn't address, is it talking about evaluating performance of the service ecosystem? Because that's very different from the transformative benefits. So we get the benefit of behavioral shift or change that occurs with Indigenous circumstances. But that's a consequence of the stimulus coming through the service that it's supposed to deliver that allows Indigenous people to leverage and get a benefit, but it's still also their behavior associated with that. And policy has to understand both, because policy has to understand the stimulus and the inputs that's required to generate that, but then also has to understand the dynamic of a community, about individuals, about societies and how they transform and change, leveraging those things, because what they don't have, we want to be able to ensure that they do, to stimulate and drive that growth in the right way. So we're trying to grow or at least give Indigenous people options so that through their leadership and their agency that they grow and their circumstances change, whether it's an individual level, that's on a community level, or a state or national level. So I think these are the things that are really confused and are not set in any way. That there's no narrative or there's no differentiation, that we're actually not being discerning enough to actually speak about those things in a strategy, which I find curious as well.
Look, I think one of the things that's left out of this evaluation framework is the fact that, a lot of the difficulty in getting towards equity with other Australians is the fact that there's systemic discrimination against us even today. So that's another factor, that how can an evaluation strategy measure that, or how will it cope with the fact that the responsibility for the inequities isn't always with us in terms of the programs that we're running or in our Indigenous affairs sector. Yep. There's also, there's a responsibility from all those other departments, and we're talking about the $5 billion in the Indigenous strategy, but you forget to mention the, 295 billion that's spent in other areas of Australian government programs that are supposed to assist as well. So, that little $5 billion is a small drop in the ocean compared to what all those other departments are doing out there anyhow. And if all those other departments are spending $295 billion a year, and how are they evaluating that? And why is it that our little there's the small amount that's dedicated to Indigenous advancement is under the microscope for why it's not, working? And I know we as Indigenous people, we want to know where the money's going and why we're not getting outcomes for that. And I think, we keep saying the same thing. There's systemic racism. We need to have shared decision making, and we need funding, appropriate funding, to be able to do those things. They're just some of the key things that I think are still relevant to the policies and programs that we're working with today.
And you're right, Nancy, because when you look at, say, education outcomes and you want to evaluate those programs, then these are state things. And so and last time I looked at the Constitution, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people were citizens of this country. So why do we need to just be, and you're right, why should we just be focusing on that $5 billion? I said this in the 2014 budget round when everyone was just talking about it was $4 billion then. And I said, why don't you look at the entire budget? Because the education budget is about educating us and our kids. The health budget is about providing health services for us and our kids. And the list just keeps on going on and on and on. So sometimes we just let ourselves get corralled into one little area and just focusing on that. I just want to give thanks to the goodsource.news for hosting our live stream tonight. If you want news you can trust, if you want media that isn't compromised by anti-everything narratives, you want the good source. Go to the goodsource.news to hear from some of the best conservative thinkers in Australia and New Zealand, to hear independent voices on a free speech platform. Now let's go back into the talk here. So let's get to the elephant in the room. Does government have the courage to actually turn over every rock? Do they have the courage to actually get their hands off the control of this and let Aboriginal communities run their programs that they need to do themselves and be accountable for running those programs?
I want to pick up one of my themes, and that's being able to talk up Indigenous business and private enterprise. And it goes to your question right now, Warren, about courage. And obviously there's an opportunity for Minister Ken Wyatt to show leadership on this. So there are two suggestions I'm going to make here. Firstly, on that $5 billion a year, would the federal government have the courage to turn around and say, we will commit that a minimum of 50% of that total expenditure will go to Indigenous community-controlled organisations and Indigenous businesses? And they can do that with a stroke of a pen. The minister doesn't need anyone else's authority for that. The government doesn't need to consult with anyone with that. They could do that, and they could turn around and say, as part of the recovery of the Australian economy from the 1st of January, 50% of the total budget on Indigenous affairs will be spent with Indigenous organisations. That alone would unlock an economic powerhouse within the community sector. We'd see Indigenous employment skyrocket, and I'm sure we'd see Indigenous controlled education initiatives really get to scale, which is what we're aiming for. So that's the first suggestion. The other suggestion is this Indigenous procurement policy, which is now set at 1.25% of the value of Commonwealth contracts. The ambition is to get to 3% in 7 years' time. In 7 years' time is before we get to that mandated minimum 3%. Now, the facts tell us that nearly 2/3 of all startup businesses fail within 3 years. So to be told to wait for 7 years to get to 3% is literally throwing in the towel. So if we could see some courage around that Indigenous procurement policy, the courageous thing might be that the government would turn around and say, we're going to bring that 3% target forward, and that'll be effective on every new contract from the 1st of January 2021. Two very specific initiatives which would do a mountain of good for Indigenous enterprise and business, because you would bring scale and volume to the market. It would allow those companies to build with some certainty. It would bring market tension and competitive tension in, because suddenly there would be a benefit. There would be a true reward for those that were great at doing what they could do. And so both of those things would be courageous, it seems, for the federal government, and yet both could be achieved with a stroke of a pen and wouldn't cost the government an extra dollar on any of their current commitments. Full stop.
Darren, my comments on that is I agree. I think what's interesting though is that part of the big challenge we have in this sort of situation is, Indigenous business, and I've now lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. We've got. Actually, can we come back to that, Darren? Because I've completely lost my train of thought. I don't know how I did that. My sincere apologies.
Well, you've got to stop killing flies, okay?
Yeah, I know. I was getting the mosquito. Yeah, I know. Sorry.
Nancia, go.
It's a great point. If you handed control over to Indigenous private sector as well, Darren. But I mean, what if we were to use that same money in our community-controlled sector to solve that issues? Isn't it's sort of the same. It's not the same thing, because one's commercial and one's community controlled. But those community controlled organisations have been there for a long time. So shouldn't we be supporting them more? I think one of the issues that we have in solving or getting to some sort of equity level is the fact that, and I'm sure that I've been in government for years, since the late 80s, right? I was in DAA, ATSIC. I was when they crossed over in Canberra and Aboriginal hostels. I've worked in, National Congress even. But what I've noticed over lots of time, over that period of time, is it seems like the mechanisms that have worked well, we don't give them long enough to be able to settle in and to be able to have continuity for the programs that work before we suddenly all the rules change again, whether it's because of a government or whether it's because of a politician, a minister who's changed. And we're constantly dealing with this change, and it makes it really, really difficult for us to be able to achieve something or to make even how long, and with this evaluation strategy, I'm not sure if it's in there or not, but is it going to give our programs and the community orgs that are going to run them the opportunity to let them settle in and to refine it and to hone those programs and the processes too, so that they can be able to, I don't know, just operate more efficiently over a longer period of time. It's that constant change of funding programs and the little bits of money that we get all the time to be able to try and get something running. I don't know if you've noticed, but when you're doing one program in some of the sectors that I've worked in, you've got you might have up to 5, maybe more different funding bodies you've got to quit for that. I mean, when you're focusing on all that compliance, how can you, it's really difficult for you to have your eye on the end game, which is the outcomes, because often these organisations are resource strapped. They've sometimes volunteers working in them as well, people working outside the organisation as well as those inside. And we know that lots of Indigenous workers in these organisations, they're not in the middle management sector. Often they're at the bottom of those organisations and at the top of them, and there seems to be that sort of high skilled project management level in the middle management. They're often not at that level. So if we could get a bit of consistency in the funding arrangements like they do in the arts sector, I know that our key arts organisations, they get, I think it's a 4-year time frame in the peak body to enable them to work towards a longer term planning. That's an issue for our community controlled organisations and for our programs as well.
And you're right, we do have some amazing organisations out there. The Aboriginal Medical Services, for instance, the community medical service sector. It's governance, its operations, and how they utilise their funds and delivering health services and that out there is second to none. They do a really good job. Okay, there may be some out there that are not, but you can weed them out. The vast majority of them are doing a very good job. We need to resource them and about how do they, innovate with different things. Like I remember the big change that came in a few years ago when they started using that. Some of them were just working on grants. They then started using the Medicare card. And I was listening to some of the medical services in the Northern Territory, and some of them said just by using the Medicare card, that they got an income growth of $4 million per annum, so that's how good they are. And so we need to, how do we work that and let them run their organisations in that, and so. But I get back. So there's two attacks. One is that. So you're looking at the community sector and the great job that the Aboriginal Medical Service is doing, but we need to. How do we get that across to other areas in regard to like education and stuff like that?
Yeah, there's a lot of stability in the. I just wanted to make the point that there's a lot of stability in the health sector. You've been places like Aboriginal Medical Service, and there's been Redfern, and there's people who've been there since the start. And I think that's, one of the factors that enables their stability and enables them to be able to deliver effective programs. Yeah.
Yes, that's correct. And then getting back to Darren's point, which is that the thing that's really going to make the difference is how do we get communities to have their own small to medium businesses, and how do we get investment in there, because we already know the statistics on a global stage from Indigenous communities across the world, as well as the wider communities across the world, is that in rural and remote areas and even in cities, the biggest employers are small to medium businesses. And so we need to, if we're going to create economic prosperity in these communities, then how do we get the investment in? How do we take the challenge of that investment in there and build the capacity of those people to run their businesses? And that's going to take a little bit of time. I reckon 3 years is a good pace. How do we support small, because we know the first 3 years is crucial to small business. How do we support them to get through that 3-year period and build an industry? And then how do we, and I got this from the Catholics and I got this from Croatians and other people, you notice when they do business, they're actually working with another Croatian or they're working with another Catholic or something like that. So then how do we cross-fertilize each other? So for instance, the medical service having their audits and finance people, why don't they have an Indigenous business?
Yep.
If the Aboriginal community shire councils, if they're hiring the waste management company, why don't we have a regional Indigenous waste management company doing that? And so that's how we can cross-fertilize these things, which then creates jobs.
I totally agree, Warren. And look, I mean, I think we need to have that diversity at those areas, those local communities, the way we want to have the greatest amount of impact. And the point, sorry, I lost my train of thought earlier, but I think part of the issue, of course, is that it's having that diversity in the ecosystem, in the sort of economy, if you like, in local communities where, and also having Indigenous business, because they're important to that ecosystem, because they're the organizations that catch money, they're invested locally, and they circulate money. And then more people who are Indigenous being employed, again, catch money and they circulate money in the economy. It's really simple economics. And I think part of the issue, of course, is that to me, if there's any kind of evaluation, if anything, we talk about the Indigenous procurement policy or any of the big stuff, is that the strategies that are really big, that measure big numbers, are really great. But what they don't do is that they probably don't get granular enough. And we probably need to get granular. We need to understand the life cycle and the behavior of money and how it flows from the top all the way down to community, because that's where the impact's at. And maybe if you're talking about evaluation in that context, I'd say, yes, I agree. But to me, it's more a tool of enabling us to understand the behavior and then improving it and tweaking it so that we get the impact where we want it. And if that's what they're talking about in evaluation terms, I'd be in that. But if they're just talking about just being totally loose and not really guiding that direction and having a story, a narrative around what it is that they're trying to do, then I'm just going to be just as confused as I always have been about some of the stuff that we do. So that's kind of the way I see it, is that I think it's driving that into the point where communities leverage the investment, the policies, the strategies, they create the options, but all of that actually creates a benefit that actually is circulated and is retained by community, because that's the asset growth that we want in Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people. So,
yeah. Well, I think we need to go and leave it at that point. This discussion is just really warming up. And look, everything that was said tonight, I agree with the whole process, what you're talking about. My concern is if we're just going to have evaluations just for the sake of evaluations and just planning for planning and doing plans and all that type of stuff, then quite frankly, we're wasting our time, as well as if we're just going to set up another bureaucracy to do the evaluations, do the planning, then we're totally wasting our time. And if we're not going to focus on the different elements of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community, and I'm talking about the different regions, the different communities, and that which have different issues that they have to deal with, then we're wasting the time. And if we don't get investment and we don't support small to medium businesses and those and build capacity within those community organisations that are doing a good job out there, then we're wasting our time.
Absolutely.
And on that note, I'd like to thank you, good James, and
be careful, Warren.
I'm telling you, I'm going to ask Pelichet not to open the border, because I know if I get to Brisbane, they're going to punch me out. So anyway, Darren, good on you, and also Nancia, of course, the beautiful Nancia. Thank you for your comments tonight, and we'll be back again in the next week for another Mundine's Truth Talking. Thank you, and good night.